Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Rust Belt Startup. I'm your host, Ryan Miller, and Rust Belt Startup is a podcast full of long-form conversations with educators, entrepreneurs, artists, people living unconventional lives in unconventional locations. And today, this is a conversation I've been working on getting recorded for probably 4 months. Finally was able to nail down my guest here. It's busy season, it's election season. My guest today is Mr. Richard Young. He's the founder of an organization called CivicLex's. You can learn more about them at CivicLex's.org. And originally met Richard when I was at a conference down in Durham, North Carolina. It was called the Cityscape Summit. I was down there speaking on a panel about equitable entrepreneurship. And I went to the session on, what was the session about? It was about like key community stakeholders and civic engagement. And Richard was one of the panelists. And I was incredibly inspired by what he had to say about the work that he's done in Lexington, Kentucky with CivicLex's. And so CivicLex's is a organization that is kind of a bridging organization between local government and the public, where they seek to basically increase civic engagement, community cohesion, and government responsiveness. And we're going to get into all of those things, but they do it through workshops and education and websites and newsletters. And I think really do the work of making local government accessible and kind of reducing some of the distance between the people with power and the people without power, where the more people that are involved, the better decisions get made for their local city. The thing is, this is an organization that is not necessarily an advocacy group. Like, they don't take positions on issues; they take positions on process, as he describes to me. So we talk about how do you build an organization that is a bridging organization within a community, building trust not only with local government officials, but with the public. We'll talk about one of the big initiatives that they were a part of, which was the comprehensive land use discussion around Lexington, and how they held hundreds of conversations throughout the city, collected over 17,000 responses about the priorities of the cities of Lexington, and how those, what surprised them about what people actually cared about when you take the time to ask and don't make things a binary decision. So we'll talk about that as well. This is a conversation not about business, but I think it's about the business of building a place that people want to be. When we think about small cities, especially in a place like Utica, where I am, I don't know that we have a cohesive vision of where we want to go. How can we do a better job of bridging and creating conversations, not only between our local government officials and the people who live here, but really taking the time to understand our neighbors and figuring out where we're alike rather than where those fissures are. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Richard Young. Richard, are you in Lexington? Like, where are you? Where does this podcast find you right now?
Yeah, I am in our relatively new office here in downtown Lexington. We just moved offices a couple weeks ago, and so we're still getting settled. Gosh, at this point, a month ago, but we're still getting settled. But yeah, I'm right here in the heart of Lexington. This is stone's throw from City Hall.
Are you from Lexington originally?
Yeah, I grew up here. I spent most of my life here. I went away for school, for college, and moved back to Lexington in about 2012. I've been here since then.
For folks that have no idea what we're going to be talking about today, I just want to get right into, like, what is CivicLex's? If you had to explain it to someone like me that we met at this conference, like, I was fascinated by this project, fascinated by what you do. How do you explain it to people?
Yeah, so I talk about CivicLex's as an organization that is really focused on strengthening civic health, and I think a lot of people don't know what that term means, and I think there's part of that is understandable, but part of it's also exciting for us because we can sort of help define it for people. So civic health is really about how communities are organized to be able to address their problems. It's sort of a concept that comes out of the National Civic League and the National Conference on Citizenship. And how we think about it at CivicLex is really, how do we make decisions as a community? How do we bring people in who are being really directly impacted by public policy decisions? How do we bring them not just to the table, but how do we um, really thoroughly integrate them into the decision making process? And so for us, what we're focused on when we talk about civic health is really sort of three core outcomes that we're trying to address. One of them is civic literacy. So how do people understand our civic systems, understand their role in them, understand what's happening at the moment in sort of civic life in our community? Um, the second one is focused on social cohesion. So, how do people connect with other people? How do people connect with people that are different from them? And in particular, how do people connect with people that have a different level of political power than they do? Um, and the third piece of the sort of outcome that we're focused on inside the civic health lens is institutional responsiveness. How responsive are our civic institutions to public participation? How responsive are they to stimulus? Right, like how are they serving the public in a way that is responsive to their needs in any given moment? So those are the three sort of things that we're focused on through our work, and there are a variety of ways that we're working on that. I'm sure we'll get into.
I'd love to dig before we get into those specifics because I think I have just so many questions around each of them.
Yeah.
How did you end? You're the founder of this organization, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
How did you end up here? There has to be a story or something that happened where you're like, I could be out selling insurance or doing a hedge fund or something, but I want to work on civic engagement. Where were you in terms of your thinking, your place in life where you're like, this is I'm going to try to build this? Because we're in I mean, of all things to try to build, this does not sound like the easiest thing to do.
No, it is not. It was not. It was not. It was definitely not an easy thing to fill. But yeah, I mean, so I think my journey to CivicLex really is a little bit windy. So I went to school for music, which is a little bit odd for someone doing what's essentially public policy work right now, right? Um, I went to school for music performance, right? And I spent a lot of time playing in ensembles and playing in orchestras, and really getting this sort of um, this sense of like collaboration that really is just so ingrained in you when you're in that sort of environment, that it sort of trickles throughout your life no matter what you end up doing. After school, I moved back home, and after a little while, and you know I'd become really jaded on the classical music industry, and actually on the music industry more broadly. I was both a classical and jazz musician, and I guess I still am, but that's what I was doing professionally. And I just got very jaded on that industry, and so I sort of started this path from playing music to organizing music events. I was the executive director of a music festival here for a little while, and put on concerts all over town, and did a bunch of things like that. And some friends of mine up in Cincinnati went through this program at New England Conservatory that is about training musicians in this model of essentially like social development through music, called El Sistema, that came out of Venezuela. And I sort of became inspired by their work in Cincinnati, and ended up sort of making my way into community development, and ended up co-founding and running a community development corporation here in Lexington for a few years. And that was a really a big departure. It sounds like sounds very sudden, but it felt, I think, a lot more gradual at the time. And community development, I think there's like little work that is harder than place-based community development. It's really personal. It's really challenging. And yeah, and so I did that for a number of years, and had a falling out with my organization, that I don't necessarily need to go into at this
Sure.
point, but sort of left feeling frustrated, and feeling like there was more that I could contribute to my community. And in that process, in that time, and in this community development corporation, I uh, spent a lot of time in City Hall, more than most people, which is basically nothing. So I guess literally any time more than most people, and saw how relatively straightforward it was to actually be able to impact decisions being made in local government. And sort of conversely saw that there were all of these major decisions happening, actually with relatively few people at the table. And so, you know, out of I think this frustration from my previous organization, and out of this sort of understanding that it was really possible for people to positively impact things that are happening in their community. Um, CivicLex kind of came out of that. The you know the technical details. I met some people who had an organization that had been vacant for a number of years. And vacant is maybe the wrong word. Had been
Stagnant.
stagnant, dormant,
Yeah.
not operational, and sort of had been working on this idea of how can we engage people in decision making more easily. And my idea sort of meshed with trying to figure out with them trying to figure out what they wanted to do, and we ended up sort of just putting it all um, into this big bucket, and that became CivicLex. Uh, yeah, that would have
I
been
like how you're jaded from the classical music industry, and you're like, what would be maybe less jaded? Let's do civic engagement.
yeah.
That to
Really,
me seems like a
I
step
just have a
backward.
habit of picking more increasingly complex and frustrating, career paths. I don't
Yeah.
I don't know why I keep doing this, but I do, I guess.
You know, one of the things that was really interesting to me when I went to your panel in Durham and heard you kind of tell. I want to get in the story into the story of the comprehensive land use plan because I think that really encapsulates I think what you guys did well. I was super impressed with that. But the question that was in my head at the very beginning is when you're talking about social cohesion and engagement. It to me the initial challenge seems to be how do you do this in a way where you're not necessarily taking sides or have I think when most people look at engagement or community organizing development there's a point of view there's a
Yep.
there's a specific issue. How did you start to think about this and go how can we be or are you not neutral in some capacity?
I mean, I like to say that we're issue neutral but we are certainly not process neutral, right? I think we're not interested in obtaining a particular policy outcome. We're not okay, we want, more housing density, or we want, you know, uh, better stormwater management, right? Those aren't things that we're trying to direct things towards. But I think what we are certainly not neutral on is how people are involved in process. Right? I think it's it's kind of a little bit of a challenging line to walk, right? Because I think the sort of premise of our organization is that the current methodologies of engaging the public in decision making are inadequate. That is a point of view.
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think it's a point of view we don't ever that we're not going around and saying that, and we certainly aren't oh, all of our civic institutions are bad at engaging people in decision making. That's not the foot that we put forward. I think, because in some cases they are, and in some cases they aren't, right? I mean, the thing I always try and tell people, right, is with any civic institution, for instance, our local government. I mean, there are 2,700 people that work for local government. There are countless divisions and departments, each of which have staff that operate in very different ways, and so there isn't one way that an institution works. There are a sort of an infinite number of ways that an institution works, and so um, what we're trying to really the argument I think that we're making is that on the whole, any process can be better, no matter what, and better process will yield better outcomes. They'll yield outcomes that are closer to what people are the sort of needs that exist in communities. They will yield outcomes that are better suited for what for what would be best for our whole city. Um, and so, we're not interested in advancing particular outcomes aside from processes that can produce better outcomes no matter what the end result is, if that makes sense.
Totally. I think you did a great job of explaining that. If we go back to some of the pillars, you talked about cohesion, and you talked about responsiveness and engagement. We did I get the third one? What were did I
Yeah,
get
yeah,
those right? It was
yeah.
cohesion, responsiveness, engagement. Um,
Well, so first literacy, civic
Literacy.
literacy, social cohesion, and institutional.
When I was researching this a little bit more to prep, I mean, your website is fantastic, and I
Oh, thank
feel like it is the field guide for if I moved to Lexington and I wanted to somehow figure out how things get done or get made. I can find my council person. I can find out what happened at the meetings, and it's done in. I felt like it's done in a way where uh, you're encouraged. It's almost like you're inviting people to participate rather than like um, shaming you for not knowing how this works. Right?
you.
I think you're very effective at that. I think it's wonderful. So, how did how are you coming? Let's start with this first one of engagement.
Yeah.
How are you measuring like what does engagement mean to you? Is it the people that show up at a council meeting? I mean, what are the things that you use to measure what works?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, I mean, honestly, like measurement of our work is, I think, one of the things that's like the hardest to really pin down. Like we can measure like the outcomes from our individual programs and projects, right? So on the engagement side and sort of civic literacy piece, there's trying to help young. We have a robust K-12 program that we're in the public school system, helping young people understand how local government works, right? Like we can measure outcomes from that. We can measure how students come into the year, where their civic literacy levels are when they come into the year and when they leave. For our events and workshops that are also sort of part of the civic literacy, we can measure, when people come to an event and when they leave an event based on surveys, right? We can measure the impact of our newsletter by how many people are reading it and sort of the actions that result from that process of reading the news and choosing to get involved by emailing a council member or going to a meeting or whatever it may be. And we can also measure the impact of some of the other sort of parts of our work. But the thing that I think we're really sort of zeroing in on right now, right, is like, how do we measure in a non-anecdotal way, and in a non like, I mean, qualitative is fine, but like, how do we measure the broader impact that our work is having on the civic life of our community? And so we're actually in the process right now of preparing to launch something at the beginning of next year, that's modeled off of one of our sort of peer organizations. They're very much in like the local news scene, which is we're part of that sort of community of this sort of like new generation of startup civic information and news organizations. But Outlier Media in Detroit, in particular, they do this annual civic information needs assessment where that they use a sort of citywide, community-wide assessment that's like, how are we advancing people's understanding of how our community works? And it's an annual measurement. And what does our community need, right? What kind of information do they need? And it's an annual measurement so they can check it over time. And so we're really looking at trying to take that model of this annual measurement, and really apply it to this sort of broader civic health, right? Like, are we actually seeing increased rates of civic literacy broadly in our community? Are we seeing changes in trust in government broadly? Are we seeing changes in participation? Are we seeing changes in all of these different um, uh, factors because of our work, right? Because we can, again, like, it's easy to say on a project by project basis, like, cool, this was a success, this is a success, this is a failure, this is a success. Um, but it's really hard to without using anecdotes that we hear from people, without using things that it's not like a clear correlation. Like, how can we really measure how our community is changing because of our work? And so that's something that we're going to be digging into this year. I mean, we're 7 years old, so I think we're kind of making up this organization as we go along. There aren't a lot of things that we can use as reference points. So So that's a bit of a work in progress. But in terms of how we measure um, our programmatic outputs, yeah, we have a huge body of research on that.
What about kind of quickly on the cohesion and responsiveness? Because those are things that I feel like are even harder to measure. So
Yeah,
cohesion. So I'm coming to you from Utica, New York. We're way upstate, Rust Belt city, uh, refugee resettlement zone.
yeah,
Um, Economically depressed for 40 years. We're on the
yep,
come up now.
yep,
And I think for us, and for I guess for maybe different communities, cohesion means different things.
absolutely.
And there's I think the face and the makeup of cities are always changing. So what does cohesion mean? How are you even agreeing on some
Mm,
of these terms?
that's a really really great question. So there's a pretty significant body of work of practitioners that are working in this space. So for me, for example, CivicLex in many ways came out of a statewide organization that I've been involved with since the very beginning um, uh, of its time in Kentucky, called the Kentucky Rural Urban Exchange, that is working on this social cohesion piece across the entire state, and particularly bringing together rural and urban communities and helping people really find their identity as a Kentuckian. Um, so a lot of our like approach to social cohesion I mean, there's no way to not use it. Like we try really hard to use accessible language, and like social cohesion is not a particularly accessible term, and it is somehow more accessible than the term I'm about to use, which is like bridging, um, which is like you're right. There's this whole field of like practitioners out there that are working on this like civic cohesion and bridging across difference, and that's really what we're looking towards, and even more inaccessible of a term, pluralism, right? Which is sort of the understanding that like we can have many different types of people. We're not working towards one cohesive, homogenous thing, right? We're working towards a community in which a lot of different types of people, a lot of different people, like groups, can all exist simultaneously, right? And that's fine. So there's this huge network out there that we're tied into through this thing called the Bridging Movement Alignment Council that we've had some involvement in. That's all folks that are working to measure social cohesion, measure how these things work. There's another organization, a funding organization called New Pluralists, that's investing in pluralism organizations across the United States. But for us, all that background to say the type of social cohesion that we're particularly focused on here is across the power spectrum, right? Because there are a lot of people like there's cohesion amongst different demographic groups, right? There's like bridging across demographic groups. There's bridging across political ideologies. There's bridging across religious groups. There are all these different ways that you can like segment and connect these different segments of people. But for us, I think one of the things that really cuts across it and really gets to our sort of broader mission of civic health is power. Um, and in particular, we know that if you are trying to get something done in local government, like if you want to see, a stop sign put in a street in your neighborhood, right? Like a very simple thing theoretically. Um, knowing the decision makers is going to dramatically change your ability to do that, right? Like if you know people in traffic engineering, if you know people in planning, if you know who your council member is, and you know that you actually have 4 council members that represent you, like in the city, you know that is going to really impact your ability to to make any progress on an issue you care about. And for a long time, the you know by nature of how local government works, by nature of how power works, there's been like a relatively small group of people that have had those relationships. And so what we're really interested in doing is broadening that out and opening up that sort of relational access to anybody. Um, and we do that through workshops and events, right? We do that through things as structured as like hosting these like budget workshops and teaching people about the city budget and having people on council and in the city's revenue department and finance department there present in the meetings so that they can meet them and know who they are and understand like their motivations. We do that like somewhat informally in other ways too. So, sometimes we'll just do whole events that are like kind of silly, fun things that can provide that connection. So like last fall, we did a workshop that was basically just come here and like craft a birdhouse and like just like make a little topiary thing. But
Mhm.
like we'll have like elected officials and we'll have city staff there so that you can meet them and like work alongside them. Um, and like, it's not about trying to overcome a political issue. It's about trying to give people enough opportunities in a recurring amount of time to start to build a relationship with these people, right? That are working in local government. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think, and I feel like one that then kind of folds into responsiveness. If I have a relationship, things are more responsive. There's a flywheel effect that you're attempting to create. What I wanted to ask on the cohesion and kind of the leveling out of layers between citizen and decision maker
Mhm.
is, have you found that in Lexington in particular that uh, there's been receptivity to that? Because I also feel that in some places, or there must be in the bell curve of elected officials, folks that are like, I just don't want to engage
Yeah.
direct, like this seems hard, right?
Yeah.
And so how do you align incentives for that to flourish?
That's an excellent question. So I think my initial answer or initial caveat, I guess, right, is like there are 2,700 people that work for local government. This will appeal to some and will not appeal to others, and like we just have to accept that as fact. There are some people, thinking about our like council members. There are some people on council that show up to our events like all the time. Like they're everything we ask them to come to, they will be there. And then there are some people on council who have never showed up to a single one of our events ever, and like that's fine. You know, it's not ideal. We wish everyone would show up to everything, but like we understand that this doesn't align with everyone's viewpoint. And our job is to demonstrate for people um, that they have a positive incentive in working in this way, right? They have a positive incentive uh, to broaden out their relationships, right? So I'll give you like an example, right? So there have been, I think, a lot of times where there have been really challenging, complex issues that people don't really feel like they ever have a chance to connect with local government officials on, right? And folks in local government don't really feel like they ever get a chance to actually talk about it as a real human being with people, right? Because the typical process for them engaging, for the public engaging with local government is like in a council meeting where when you give public comment, you're not even the council is not even allowed to respond. Like it is in the
Right,
council
right.
rules that they cannot talk back to you. And so a lot of times people go into those situations and they feel like council members don't hear what they're saying. And oftentimes they're going to the Thursday night council meetings where like when ordinances and resolutions are being read aloud, like council's actually just like walking around and like, they're on their phones or they're like not paying attention because this is this procedural process. And there's no sort of decisions to be made. Like it's a procedural part of the meeting. Um, and so, you know, in that setting is like like perfect for breeding distrust, right? Like it is. It's like it's almost set up to 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 make it feel like your local government doesn't care about what you think. And so, in setting up these like alternate ways, right, we can show to engage with these city officials. We can show people that like no, they actually do care. Like they actually want to know what you think. It's just the structures that we have are not set up for that, right? And I think that like the example of the most common method of weighing in before a city body as being the most, you know,
Formal, right? Or the least personal, the least
yeah,
human.
exactly. Is a great snapshot of like why work like ours should exist.
I agree with you. I think in some ways once you get to public comment on the council, it's almost like things have boiled already,
Yeah,
right? Like it's, I think that's a really, and certainly we see that here. And then obviously we talked about responsiveness. I want to pivot a little bit to how I want to get into the kind of the story around land use, because this is the thing where I know nothing about land use, and when you were talking about this in Durham, I'm like, you could talk about land use all day. Like, just tell me this. It was so interesting how if you could talk about, just take me through that in terms of starting with, how Lexington is currently set up and that process. Because just to give you the facts that you gave me before, to set the stage. I mean, you were doing an enormous amount of facilitation, 500 conversations throughout the community, 17,000 open responses collected on this issue. So I want you to focus on the story and the data, if you could.
sure. Yeah. So I think a little bit of context is important for this. So Lexington is the second largest city in the state of Kentucky, right? Um, we a population of about 330,000 people. Lexington's a very old city. Like we have a university that in the city that was founded in 1795. The Lexington's celebrating its 250th anniversary next year. So it's a pretty old city. And the sort of one of the main economic drivers in Lexington is is agricultural industries. We've always had an agrarian economy in Lexington. One of my favorite sort of statistics about, or not even statistics, one of my favorite little factoids about Lexington is that we've had since 1775 linear population growth. Like we've never had a population decline ever. Like it's just like constant up, right? Like if you look at it, there's literally just like like a straight line. If you look at our population,
It's not exponential. It's not Austin, but it's just
no,
chugging along.
yes, it's chugging right along. Um, you know, and and a lot of that is because we never had an industrial boom, right? Like we certainly had industries here, but like we are one of the larger landlocked cities in the country, so we don't have a river that goes through our city. Um, and yes, we had some railroads, but like there were major urban centers that sprung up in Cincinnati, obviously, and in Louisville, and so we're sort of this like in between place that's not that never had like robust like factories. Like we just never blew up in the way that those two communities that are immediately each an hour away from us did, and therefore we also never had the corresponding population decline. And what Lexington has become increasingly known for in its agrarian ways, in particular in the past 100 years, is the equine industry. So if we our sort of subtitle is the horse capital of the world, and as a result, in the equine industry, right, we are raising like multi-million-dollar horses around in the immediate areas surrounding our city. And in this region of central Kentucky. And like, in addition to like normal agricultural farms and that sort of thing. Although a lot of those are no longer, that's like pre-tobacco settlement is when it was a much more diversified agricultural economy in central Kentucky.
It's funny. That's a line of demarcation for you. It's like the tobacco settlement was like,
Yeah, huge change.
changed everything. Yeah.
And even more so for other parts of Kentucky, right? Like Western Kentucky in particular. But Central Kentucky, anyhow, this may be getting too much into details. So, but like the horse industry is a real industry, and there's a lot of wealth in that industry, and as a result, like that has very significantly influenced Lexington's planning and growth over time. So, back in the 50s, Lexington was the first city in the country to create an urban growth boundary around our city. So we drew a line. And we said, we will not provide urban services outside of this. We will not provide sewer. We will not provide all of these things outside of this boundary. And in Kentucky, cities have to have a comprehensive land use plan. And so our city put into the comprehensive land use plan that planning process would be what determined whether or not we expanded that boundary. And so every 5 years, we have to update this plan per the state constitution. And every 5 years, that is a very big fight in our community. whether or not to expand this boundary. And this boundary is expanded and contracted multiple times since it was established. So every 5 years we have this big fight. And I think the thing that's really important to understand about comprehensive land use planning, particularly in Lexington and in many other cities as well, is that while while this while while this one decision sucks up so much oxygen, whether or not to expand this boundary or contract this boundary, um, or do nothing, because it's like a very binary decision. It's like a very clear thing that also has a lot of power oriented around it. Because of that, uh, all of these other very important policies around housing and neighborhoods and economic development and transportation and the environment all fall by the wayside, right? Like the comprehensive land use plan is so long. There are, dozens and dozens and dozens of policies that come out through it. But this one thing takes all the oxygen, and it always has. It's essentially becomes like a fight between two different political factions. A faction that is interested in rural agricultural land preservation and smart urban development, and a faction that is interested in having more housing options and expansion for economic development land and opportunity. So these two factions just sort of fight it out every 5 years through this land use planning process. So in 2022, our city was having another bout of this fight, right? We were updating our comprehensive land use plan. And so we approached the Division of Planning and said, hey, there's this process called On the Table, which is a process that was started in Chicago by the Chicago Community Trust and sort of spread to a bunch of other cities, including Lexington, where it was managed for a number of years by the Bluegrass Community Foundation, one of our partners, and they handed it off to us in 2020. And so we were like, hey, this process has been used for a lot of different things in the past. It's been used around the comprehensive plan as well. Like, we want this to be the official public input. We want to do this. We want to work with you. We will pay for it. We will raise all the money. We want this to be the official public input process for the comprehensive plan. And we want to use it to be about a broader conversation about what our vision is for our community and how policy can lead to that than just this single fight. And after several conversations with the Division of Planning, they said yes. And so through this process, essentially what we did is we created a host guide where anyone in our city could host or attend a conversation about the future of our community as it relates to land use during this 1 week in April. And so people could host conversations in their homes. People could host them in their churches, their businesses, and parks, wherever. Or there are a bunch, and they could be public or private. They could have them posted publicly on a website, or they could be private. And then there were a bunch of public conversations that anyone could go to. We put all of this together. We did a bunch of host trainings and facilitation trainings, and ended up having, as you said, 509 conversations about land use policy in 1 week, April. I can't remember exactly. Anyways, it's in April, mid-April of 2022. And in these conversations, people would come, there would be a host, and the host would explain what the comprehensive plan is and why everyone's there. And then they would walk them through these 5 questions. And at the beginning of the conversations and at the end of the conversations, they went through 2 different surveys. The first one to really understand what people's priorities were in terms of neighborhoods, environment, transportation, jobs, and their urban service boundary, rural urban balance. And then a thing at the end about if people change their mind. The survey at the end was about if they changed their mind or if they had any other thoughts to add. And so what we were able to do then is through this process, capture, well over 15,000 public comments about this issue. And we sat down about all of the issues on the comprehensive plan. We sat down with our city's Division of Planning, my entire staff, their entire staff, 28 of us, and we read through every single open response. There were some multiple choice questions, but really what we were interested in was like the open response and the nuanced questions. So
what do you actually think?
Exactly. What do you actually think?
And in your words, right?
Exactly. And So we partnered with some professors at the University of Kentucky in the public policy school to help us build a process for coding that data. And we sat there and we read together every single open response question. It took us 2 weeks, working 5 days a week, 28 of us to do all of this and to code all of this data. And as a result, we now have this robust data set that informed the comprehensive land use plan, right? And caused several policies to be put in there very directly because of what people said. But we also have this like huge body of data about what people actually care about in our city. And that like we anonymized all of that data and put it out there for anyone to use. So right now, I mean, you can go to ottlex.org, download that data set and use it for whatever you want.
I did. I was playing around with it before our call here. It's really
Oh
cool.
yeah.
It's just a big Airtable.
Yeah, it is a giant Airtable. Yeah, let me tell you, building that database is maybe the hardest part of that whole thing. Yeah. And so, some really amazing, policy changes went into place that I think reflected what people in this process wanted. And again, that's like not things that we're trying to advance. Like we don't, we think it's great. Whatever, the public is wanting to see in their.
What surprised you? What surprised you? Was there anything in there where you're like, this is really unexpected?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. The conversation is always about the urban service boundary. The urban service boundary is always connected to housing. Lexington's having has a huge housing shortage, just like every, growing city in the country. We're seeing like rates of rental rates go up really significantly, property values going up really significantly, and it's becoming a very unaffordable place to live. And I expected that to be like the top thing that people were talking about. And it was high up there. That or the urban service boundary, like is either going to be housing affordability or urban service boundary.
Well, because that was what this was about, was the urban service boundary, right?
Right. But that was actually like pretty like the urban service boundary was I think like 9 and like, or maybe even lower. And housing was like 6 or 7. The things that people talked about the most, the number one thing this was very surprising to me was bikeability and walkability. People were like, that's what we actually want. We want walking trails. We want to be able to walk to stuff. As we're getting older, we want to be able to like not have to get in a car. When we're younger, we want to be able to bike to things. And like, I know that's something that like us, I'm a cyclist. I bike a lot. And both recreationally and for commuting. And I live in a very walkable neighborhood. Those are things that I care about. I know that there's like a community of, probably several hundred people that really care about that. But for that to be the top thing that people brought up was really surprising to me. And like environment issues, right? Like environment issues were also in the top couple. And, I think for the first time, conversations about climate change, our city sent a as a result of all of this, set a carbon neutral pledge by 2050. Like a lot of things related to the environment that were not about preserving rural land came up. And so those two things were really surprising to me. And as a result, like our city's adopted a complete streets action plan. They've hired a complete streets director. They have hired a Vision Zero director to work on bicycle pedestrian fatalities. And I don't know if those are all, I mean, those are things that were prioritized in the comp plan. And maybe that's what caused them to create those programs. But I think it's really, it helped sort of give energy and weight to some conversations that our city was having, where I think different people had different understandings of what things were people's priorities. And this was just a very clear, like, this is the largest database ever. This is what people want.
I'm laughing at your complete streets thing and how that came up as, one of the top things. And because here in Utica, we also did a complete street study.
Yeah.
And the data had come down in putting down a couple of different bike lanes on our main thoroughfare, which is Genesee Street. Currently, it's four lanes across. And and sorry to everyone that's listening. This has heard me talk about this already, but so do the complete street study where basically we need a road diet. It's too big in the main thoroughfare. And did a test run of this, and data comes back, basically confirming like, hey, this makes sense. Go from 4 lanes to 3, a couple lanes on the side. The
Yeah.
council is like, yeah. We're not doing that. Not only are we not doing that, we're going to pass a resolution that outlaws bike lanes in the city of Utica. And
What?
that, yes, right? So this is where I guess I'm leading the question here, because like there's a part of me that's like, yeah, the data is great. And if you don't have people that look at like make data driven decisions, what
Yeah.
do you do?
I mean, I think that's where for us, like my answer to that would be like, that's institutional responsiveness piece, right? Like that is where,
And by
you,
the way, I'm not saying that everyone wants,
uh,
like I'm literally just saying like here's what the data seem to indicate, that this was probably on balance a decent move, and there was this slap back,
yeah,
and so I'm like, wow, that to me makes people jaded.
it does. I mean, it really does. And, I mean, we actually had like with the comprehensive plan, it wasn't all warm and fuzzies, right? Like, um, the, the, the comprehensive plan that came out of the Division of Planning and the Planning Commission that then went to council where it became a more political process theoretically than it was earlier, um, recommended not expanding the urban service boundary. And council was like, no, we think we should. And so they did. And
Hmm.
so, and that was a really politically contentious decision.
Wait, and
And
this was the one that you guys did all the conversation around? So okay, I want to just back up for 1 second, because what I'm
yeah,
hearing you say is that like the top issues would me seem to indicate that maybe the boundary shouldn't be extended. I want to put words in your mouth, but like
yeah.
that data would seem to indicate that maybe, or is that not right?
Well, I would say like the recommendation. So the data, I think, told us what people were talking about, right? Like the
Well, it
data
told a
said,
bigger story, a more nuanced story, probably.
yeah. I mean, people were talking about transportation, like not having access to public transportation. People were talking about not having bikeable and walkable communities. People were talking about, an emphasis on environmental sustainability and trying to be more, small c conservative in
Hmm.
in our decision making around like how we conserve our community. Um, and and so out of that, the Division of Planning set a bunch of recommendations for many of those things. And one of those things was an argument that from them that, um, you know, we have a housing shortage, but we think that we can work on infill and redevelopment more, which had been the primary growth strategy since 1996, the last time that the city had expanded the boundary. We think we can do this more, and we don't think there's a need to expand. And Planning Commission agreed. And then council got it. And they said, no, we think that there's too much pressure. There's too much housing pressure. And we're going to expand. And so I think like the importantly, it would be very easy for a process like what we ran to be like a tallying process, right? Where it's like, okay, how many people are for expansion? How many people are
Hmm.
against expansion? And we really tried to avoid that. And that's why we wanted to contextualize the comprehensive plan for people, right? That this is one of like 40 policies that is being set. It's an important one, but there are many other things that are, you know, at the
That
forefront.
are inside, yeah, they're related, tangential to it.
Yeah. And so council ultimately made the decision that they thought was what was needed. I think I'll leave it to the people in our community to determine whether or not they think that that is the right sentiment. But I think that what's interesting, right, is like that through this. So the city will have an adopted plan for the expansion land by the end of the year. And we're working with the planning firm that got hired to create that plan to gather public input for what this expansion land should look like. And what are we seeing? Walkable, bikeable communities, public transportation, environmental sustainability, access to green space and parks, right? So all of the things that were in all of the rest of the comprehensive plan are what are being prioritized in these areas. And so regardless of, of what ultimately happened with that very political decision, I think, about whether or not to expand, um, I think the policymaking decisions around what our community looks like are really following through on what a lot of people said that they wanted.
I really think that that's a very interesting and effective way to. I respect your ability to basically just say, like, this is what happened, and not take a side. But I also think this process, as you're describing to me, it's like you've taken a binary issue and created you've broken the binary, you know?
That's
Well, instead of us saying, "Hey, we're for the line or against the line," you
yeah,
said, "Well, look, we can talk about all these things that are related to the line, whether or not the line moves. We have intentionally um, informed the direction with which subsequent decisions may be made." I think that's really interesting. Do you feel like in Lexington, you guys have a vision for what the city is going to be in the next 10 years? Is there a cohesive vision?
that we as an organization or that us as a city.
You as a city, you as a citizen, like, do you feel like, hey, we're all rowing in the same direction?
Actually, not really. I think like that's one of the big. I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges that's confronting us right now as a city, right? Like, I think we are. I think we're in a space where like there are several competing ideas of what our city should. And I don't think that's like a particularly hot competition. Like, I don't think it's like some people are like, oh, we should be this like small, quaint college town, because the University of Kentucky's here, or like, oh, we should be, really trying to grow new manufacturing jobs. And I think that there are a lot of different versions of that. But I think that one of the biggest challenges is that I don't think we do as a community. I don't think we're all on the same page. Um, and I was looking at, I was talking with some folks down in Galveston, Texas, recently, who basically, through not a similar process, but who have been working on this sort of big, broad vision for their community, or created essentially almost like a plan of plans, right? Like what, like the way I've been sort of talking to people about it here is it's like one plan to rule them all, like how can you take all of these different visions and all these different policymaking documents from like independent authorities, right? Like our local government has a policymaking document, our local school system has a policymaking document, the University of Kentucky, which is bigger than either, right? They're like this huge like institution that is immune from zoning laws and can do whatever they want. Like they have a plan for their future. Like Transy has a plan for its future. All of these different things. And then we're in a region, right? There are all these other counties that have plans for their future. But I don't think that there is something that really ties all of that together. I think our identity to some people ties it all together, but I think that's even contested right now in a way that I think is really healthy. Like, you know, yes, horses are a big part of our city, but like, is that do we just want to be a horse town? Bourbon's a big part of our tourism. Do we just want to be a horses and bourbon town? Like, what are we as a community? And I think that we haven't quite figured that out yet. And I think it will take some pretty assertive leadership to get all of those different folks in a room together, and really get the public engaged in a citywide conversation about what we want our future to be.
That seems like a pretty good place to end it. I think where the last thing I want to ask you, I mean, there's so many other things that I want to ask you, but to me, it seems like you've also hit on in what in some cases may be a repeatable model for other cities. And obviously, that's one of the reasons I want to talk to you. Um, if someone's trying to, if someone is listening to this and is inspired by your work as I am, where does one start in the journey of kind of creating, a more comprehensive, engaged public? Like, what's
Yeah.
one thing? And I know it's like, and it can't be like go to a council meeting. Like,
Mhm.
besides that, like, where do you start?
So, I mean, God, there are a lot of places to start. I think like I would say, like, honestly, like, reach out to your elected officials and like go have coffee with them. Like, don't go to a meeting. Don't show up with an agenda. Don't show up with something that you want to change. Like, talk to them like a human being, right? Like I think people, people like our politics are so nationalized. And I think like people assume that local government and the federal government are like the same thing and that it's like an extension of the same thing. And like for a lot of people, the federal government feels like an automaton that is just, acting on its own and there really isn't any representation. And it's just this machine that's just like crunch, 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 crunch. And like, I think in a lot of ways, that's probably true. Um, but local government's like different. And like, yes, it has some automaton like characteristics sometimes, but like it's people, right? Like the people that are working in these institutions, local institutions, they play on the same soccer teams as your kids. They go to the same coffee shops. They go to the same churches. They have overlapping friend groups. They go to the same grocery stores. You see them all around. Like reach out to your elected officials, reach out to city staff, and like talk to them. Like grab a coffee and like ask them questions about what they do and why they do it and what they are concerned about. I think, you know, we too often see government as a machine and something that's inhuman. And I think what that causes is government to see the public as inhuman, as an obstacle. Right. And so I think like somewhere along the way, we have to start to bridge that gap. And I think our organization stands in that gap, right? And there's like kind of has a hand of government and a hand of the public. And it's like trying to like pull them together to hold hands themselves. But absent an organization to work on that, I think it kind of, if we wait for the institutions to become responsive to us, we're going to be waiting forever. Like we have to take the lead and trying to build that relationship. And then like find the people in local government that really are motivated to bring people in, and champion and talk to them and build a relationship.
I'll leave it there. Thank you so much. People can find you at CivicLex.org.
Yep,
You answer your email.
I do.
But I really appreciate you taking the time, Richard. I'm incredibly inspired by what you guys are doing in
Beautiful.
Lexington, and I hope that we can apply something like this where I am. So,
Yeah.
anything else you want to add? If people could, where should people reach out to you if they, or do you want people to reach out to you?
Yes, reach out anytime. It's just Richard, RICHARD at CivicLex, CIVICLEX.org. Shoot me an email anytime. I am normally good at responding to emails. Sometimes I'm in like, the chaos storm, but if I get an email, it will get responded to. I promise. It may just take a day or two.
All right. Thank you so much for the time, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Happy to do it. Thank you, sir, so much for having me.
So I want to thank Richard again for taking the time. I know it's his busy season, and you can learn more about Richard and the organization at CivicLex.org. And I would highly suggest like you go and take a look at just the data that they put in there, the newsletters that they do. I think it's a great example of how, you could very quickly be brought up to speed about what's going on in the city of Lexington. What are the issues that the council is talking about, and how you as a citizen can interface with those levers of decision makers. So definitely check that out, and let's see what else is going on. Definitely, if you could also, if you're liking this podcast, I'm doing a lot more content on the socials, but I would love it if you would subscribe to my newsletter. It's over at rustbeltstartup.com, where I'm going to be doing podcast recaps and more blog posts and social media posts on stuff that I find useful to folks in this space. And also, if you're out of the area, if you're kind of listening to this from a different part of the country, I have also launched a digital toolkit for entrepreneurs. It's called the Foundations Toolkit. It's at rustbeltstartup.com as well. That is a online course that I have dropped, taking kind of the most practical things that I've learned in coaching over 400 entrepreneurs over the years. If you're trying to start a small business or a micro enterprise, toolkit, the blueprint, and it will help maximize the opportunity for success. So I hope you check that out as well. That's it. Be good. Hope you're enjoying fall, and we'll see you next time.